Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's December the 30th of 2024. Our last show of the year will be tomorrow at this time with the great Harley Schlanger of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization for a wrap-up of the year and a look ahead into 2025. Today, I've selected a different topic. Going to do some work on the ongoing research I've been doing into my father's career and his untimely death at just barely 51 years of age. His birthday was March 21st, and he died on June the 6th of 1971. So a lot of you have been with me for a long time, and then some of you are new, and I want to make sure that everyone is with me as I delve into what's really history now, and it's untold history. It's the history of secret warriors and people who have to do secret things and plausible deniability. And me, as the only son of one of these guys, and very suspicious of his early death by what I would call quick cancer in 1971. It's been a lifelong journey for me. Practiced law for over 30 years. And then as I was able to wind down my law practice, I was able to start working on the big question. What did you do in the war, Daddy? And why do I think that they killed you with a biological warfare weapon, i.e. cancer? So part of my show has always been about things like SV40 and the possibility, and I'm getting closer and closer to resolving some of those questions with our good friend Adam Finnegan, whose expertise, he's just been so generous with me trying to answer my questions, as well as to try to help people who suffer with these chronic diseases, Lyme and as well as cancer, to understand what's behind it and what we can do to save the rest of the future from further manipulation of us by biological means or technological means, and somehow to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, which is really the only thing that keeps us from being enslaved at any particular moment. We have to take this very seriously as we do it, so we try to do it in small bites. I limit my shows to an hour usually. Sometimes I'll go over with a very interesting guest when we're in the middle of something, but an hour of this, I've just spent about 6 hours preparing for the show, and so that's going to be my work for the day. Then I'm going to go out and work on my garden because it's 50-something degrees out there on December the 30th, and so I want to go outside and catch some sunshine and enjoy this brief a bit of warm weather. Okay, so let's go with who is Victor Krulak and who is Ed Lansdale. Well, as you know, Ed Lansdale is a spook, a Army general who works for the CIA, and he is the guy that set up the Huck Rebellion in the Philippines to take over the Philippines for, Marcos and his CIA buddies. He's the guy that basically destroyed Vietnam by organizing the boat lifts and sending, putting DM, this Catholic Mandarin type guy, into Saigon, which has very few Catholic influences when he arrived. And he was, his brother, the great dope dealer, and his wife, Madame New, the notorious dope dealer. The Ed Lansdale version of counterinsurgency. It involves false flags. It involves dope. It involves treachery. And it is the kind of warfare that real soldiers abhor, don't want to be involved in that. And that's the story I think you're going to hear today as we confront the difference between Ed Lansdale's warfare and that proposed and for a while instigated by General Victor Krulak. General Victor Krulak, a major general by the time he was appointed to the SACSA position, has a very interesting biography. And while I want to make sure that you are aware of this very important book, which is the source of most of what I'm saying today, The Secret War Against Hanoi by Richard H. Schultz Jr., lots of tidbits of information to me that is just crucial to my understanding. It's a book I bought at least 10 years ago. So you can see, as I was able to put time into it, and I've been studying this for, at least 10, 15 years now. So the secret war against Hanoi, Kennedy and Johnson's use of spies, saboteurs, and covert warriors in North Vietnam. A sad tale, using prisoners of war to carry out crazy helicopter missions or dropped with parachutes into enemy territory. Sad results for everybody, because the idea that they could carry that off was proven wrong. Every time they tried it, the poor person that had to carry on the mission was captured, and for a while they just flipped them, and the Americans didn't know, so they were getting false information fed by their supposed agents in North Vietnam. Anyway, that book is a fascinating account and has a lot of pertinence to understanding who McDuff was and why he was selected to leave the FBI to go work at SACSA when it was first set up in February of 1962. I might remind you that the first and most important book that I read when I started this show 5 years ago was this one, The Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty. He's the first person that I read anything about SACSA in, and to understand the difference between what standard military doctrine was and what the CIA folks were doing. And that, I guess, brings us back to the difference between Ed Lansdale and a real Marine General, Victor Krulak. I want to start by reading from an oral history interview, and I'm going to just read the thing to you. It won't take too long, but it's this history of Victor Krulak's career. And of course, if you know anything about him at all, you know that he had an adventure with President Kennedy during World War II as a result of his boat getting nearly sunk on a coral reef. And who comes along to rescue him but the future president of the United States, Jack Kennedy. Victor H. Krulak, oral history interview, November 19th, 1970. Now, think about that also, just that date, November 19th, 1970. I am in my first year of college at College of William and Mary. My dad has dropped me off, and basically that was our goodbye. I'm now on my own trying to survive in a college environment where I'm not paying a lot of attention, of course, to politics, but this is when the Sante raid happens. It was supposed to happen in October of 1970. It didn't. And we think Henry Kissinger was the reason why, because it got delayed until November. And then for all intents and purposes, it was a failure. The Sante prison camp raid of November 1970, that is. And one of the speculations that I make, and I think I have good grounds for it, is that my dad was the senior planner of that operation. Although you won't find his name on it. Plausible deniability. Don't let him find the real source of authority for things that go on. Well, let's get into Victor Krulak's oral history interview. Krulak was a Lieutenant General, United States Marine Corps, specialist in counterinsurgency, and a member of the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In this interview, he discusses his earliest contact with John F. Kennedy in the Solomons, the Special Group CI on Counterinsurgency, Robert S. McNamara, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., and Krulak's observations on Vietnam, among other issues. All right. And the interviewer, William W. Moss, asks the questions. And the first question is, now, if you would begin again with your earliest contact with John Kennedy in the Solomons. Krulak. In the autumn of 1943, I commanded a battalion of Marine paratroopers. Just before the Bougainville invasion, my battalion was directed to land at night from destroyers on the island of Choiseul, which is next south from Bougainville, and in the ensuing 4 days to behave like a much larger force attacking the enemy with as much vigor as we could to persuade them that we represented at least the vanguard of a very large operation, and thus to cause them to redeploy their forces from Bougainville, or at least to divert their attention from Bougainville. The Bougainville operation was thus to be supported by this diversion. The operation went off essentially as it was planned. We attacked the Japanese in a number of places, and their radio traffic disclosed that they were bemused, if not deceived. The Bougainville landing went off on schedule, and we continued to attack the Japanese on Choiseul for another couple days, feeling that there was still an advantageous opportunity. But the Japanese soon became aware that we were small, not big. There were 5,000 of them and 700 or 800 of us. We soon found, instead of being on the offensive, we were under attack. On one occasion, following one of our raids, the Japanese came at us in great force, and one of my companies was obliged to withdraw under fire in daylight. I had screamed for air support and PT boat support. The aircraft came, and the PTs came, and they were Kennedy's division. They covered us as best they could. One of my boats ran on a coral head and wiped its bottom out. And as it was sinking, one of the PT boats came alongside and pulled the survivors out of the water. It was Kennedy's boat. They brought them back to the little base area where we were on the island of Choiseul, and we reassembled there. His division's operations were probably the difference between success and failure in this little enterprise on that day. I felt pretty beholden to him. I told him that one day we would be together again, and I owed him a bottle of whiskey, and I'd see that he got it. I was thinking of our being together on the island of Vella La Bella, where his squadron was based, and where my battalion was in fact based. Well, I was wounded and evacuated. I ended up in the United States, and I never saw Kennedy to give him the whiskey, but I kept the bottle. 3 feathers it was. Doesn't mean anything to you probably, but 3 feathers was just the most wretched rot gut in the world. And one day I was going to give it to this fellow. You know, I sort of lost track of him, but I owed it to him, and one day I was going to give it to him. I kept it, and it followed me around in my chattels. Then he got to be president, and I was ordered to Washington. He sent for me, and we chatted about the Solomons. I didn't bring the bottle of whiskey with me because I was, sort of on my mettle. I wasn't going to do anything like that in the first moment, but on another occasion, I brought him the whiskey. Of course, he didn't remember that I had promised him a bottle of whiskey, but he knew the circumstances, and he accepted it with great enthusiasm. He said his problem would be deciding when to drink it. Is this the same bottle after all? Oh yeah, same bottle of World War II 3 feathers. Pretty bad. Often subsequently, we talked about our experiences in the Solomons and this very, very hairy business where he did something very great for my people. This established a real nexus between us, although we had little time to talk about history in terms of oppressiveness of the Vietnam business. But it did, nevertheless, establish a relationship which made it very easy for me to talk to him when I wanted to. And I did. I made great use of it, I believe, in terms of opportunities to try and tell him the very complicated things that were on my mind as I learned about that odd kind of war. What do you recall of your impressions of him when he was in the Solomons? Anything lasting? Just a very serious, nice guy, very serious. Question, okay, now, what were the circumstances of your being called back to the Pentagon? It was under orders. Was this something set up beforehand of your particular expertise? Was the job created for you to do as it was needed, or what? Krulak. No, President Kennedy knew no more about the kind of war with which we were faced in Southeast Asia than many other people in authority, although he had much more responsibility. But he did have the sense to say, this is new and it is different and it is complex, and the military had better organize for it. What I want at every level, starting at the very top with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and going down through all of the armed services, is an organization for counterinsurgency. I want each of the armed services to designate a man, and I want to know his name. They've got to be people who have some competence in this sort of thing to the extent that anyone has. And that is a putative quote from JFK by Krulak, speaking off the cuff, of course. Well, I was selected to be the one at the top at the Joint Chiefs of Staff level. When I talked to the president on my first visit, he made no slight implication that he had selected me, and I do not believe he did. But he said he was glad, but I don't believe that he made the choice. Why was I chosen? I spent a lot of time in Asia. I can speak some Chinese. I had the kind of small unit, low-level experience that it was presumed was important here. I had written on guerrilla warfare. Little did they realize that we weren't really talking about guerrilla warfare. We were talking about political warfare. The reservoir of ignorance was almost unlimited, and we all learned together, really, some more slowly than others. The first hurdle was to get over was to persuade the armed services that this just wasn't more guerrilla warfare. This in itself was an almost Himalayan task. Some of them during my whole tenure were not persuaded. The second task was to try and pull together everything that was conceivably useful and codify it. I undertook to do this, to prepare a doctrine, which I did. I prepared a book called Joint Counterinsurgency Doctrine. It was an impressive thing, more volume than value, but it was a beginning. Then the project of making the armed services report to me what they were doing, because I had to report it to McNamara, and with him to the president, of course, that being Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara. This was not easy because mostly they weren't doing much, but they gradually developed a head of steam in their boilers to the extent that it became a very respectable endeavor. Then there was the question of education. Each of the services was obliged to undertake an educational program. The Army launched it very aggressively. The Army is characteristically good at educational matters, in school teaching and in organization for education. They did extremely well, as a matter of fact. Organizationally, the Air Force did well, the Marines fairly well, the Navy least well of all. Then there was the matter of tactical organization. We undertook in my office to monitor the tactical efforts and developments of the various services, the SEAL, Sea, Air, Land teams of the Navy, and the COIN, Counterinsurgency Aircraft Program of the Air Force, the Green Berets initially, and the Green Berets of the Army. This, as you may know, was a diversion of another function. Excuse me a second. By the way, I hope you can see this is my SACSA mug, my dad's mug from SACSA's 10-year anniversary. They all got one of these mugs. His has his name on the back of it, and I'm very proud to have preserved it all these years. It is a solid record that SACSA did exist, that my dad was part of it. And as long as I have this mug that says SACSA on it right there, nobody can deny that SACSA existed. Okay, now here's a point that I want to emphasize. This, as you may know, was a diversion of another function. The Green Berets, initially, were aimed at something quite different than counterinsurgency. They were aimed at behind-the-lines inspiration of partisans. But they were employed for this purpose. All of these things were the functions of my office, but by all odds, the most interesting was my relationship with the Secretary of Defense and the President. So you see, these are basically the Operation Gladio forces, or otherwise guerrilla forces. But what they're doing here in counterinsurgency is trying to win the hearts and minds of the people for the government, for the national government. And Krulak's idea, the standard military idea, was to form security, make sure that they have support for their transportation, for their food, for their health, for their own government, to support the local town leaders or county administration, to try to make sure that the government of the country doesn't fall. And in order to do that, to win the hearts and minds of the people. That is not the Ed Lansdale method. The Ed Lansdale method of counterinsurgency is to find a minority group, arm them, have them do something violent. When the reaction comes, then you get a civil war going, and you arm both sides if necessary to make sure that the country is pretty well devastated. And then you come in with American programs to take over the economic resources and probably install some puppet dictator like they did in the 50s in Central and South America. So the difference between Krulak and Lansdale is the difference between Kennedy and somebody like Bush. And I think to emphasize that difference is one of the things I'm trying to accomplish in my work, because you have to believe that there are good guys in these positions, or else we won't support our own government. And I do believe that the real honest military guys were, fully patriotic, fully there to fight to the death to support the Constitution of the United States, as the oath says. But the people that are working for, the Dulles brothers, as we talk about so much, I don't think they give a damn about the Constitution of the United States. They're all there to expand the empire that they are a part of. And that empire stretches as far as they can stretch it across the world. And who cares about sovereignty or national borders or anything like that when you're trying to take over the world with an empire that's already done 80 to 90% of it and just doesn't want to stop and observe human rights along the way. Let's just put it that way. With such an interest on the part of the president and the secretary, and you being in a position on the joint staff, in effect, how much difficulty was there in that, since you ostensibly report to the joint chiefs? Now, what this question is that Krulak was reporting to McNamara directly, but Krulak is a 2-star Marine general. He's jumping a number of lines of authority to talk directly to McNamara, but that's what McNamara ordered him to do. So the question is, how did that go? Krulak says, you're very right. Mr. McNamara has, as you may know, a great flair for straight line organization. In order to ease the pain, he just gave me another job, reporting directly to him. So I had two tasks. One task, which was routine, the special assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for Counterinsurgency, that is the SACSA. And the other was, I've forgotten the title, but in any case, it was responsive directly to the Secretary of Defense. So this immediately solved his problems with the Joint Chiefs and solved mine with the Joint Chiefs too. We never had any problem. The two chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under whom I served, Generals Lemnitzer and Taylor, that's Maxwell Taylor, of course, were most helpful, just the reverse of their being institutionalized or troublesome. I had difficulties with the joint staff structure occasionally, but those were wholly manageable and they didn't keep me up at night. I did work hard for McNamara with the State Department, with CIA, and occasionally with some White House instrumentality on counterinsurgency. After all, we started from an initial zero, and since I was putting my total time on it, I was learning faster than most of the rest of them. So I had a nickel's worth of one-upsmanship only because of the amount of time I had to devote to it. Moss, the interviewer, I remember myself seeing at the time many books beginning to come out on guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency and that sort of thing. General Taylor is often given credit for being the catalyst with his The Uncertain Trumpet book, and Robert Kennedy is often mentioned as being a very active, interested person in the whole counterinsurgency business. What do you think of the impact of these people? Well, let me just interject that when the SACSA rotated, General Krulak left, I think, in '64, and then General Anthus was appointed as the new SACSA. My father and mother had a cocktail party at our house for General Anthus, and I remember. Of course, we kids weren't allowed to come to the party. We had to be in bed. But my dad had a copy of Maxwell Taylor's book on An Uncertain Trumpet, sitting right out on the little book on the little table with the lamp on it. And I just think that's something that, again, a real memory of mine of how my dad was right there with the guy, with Anthus, and reading Maxwell Taylor. And of course, my grandfather said that my dad went to Vietnam with Maxwell Taylor on his mission, which was a secret thing. I don't have another documentation of it, but that's well, my grandfather probably knew what he was talking about. My dad confided him, I'm sure. So anyway, just another personal insertion there, if you don't mind. I apologize if you're slowing down the reading, but all of this is personal to me. Okay, and Krulak says, I can tell you, the catalyst was a thing called the Special Group CI, Counterinsurgency. It met in the old State Department building, in the old State building, the White House Annex, that is the Executive Office Building. Executive Office Building, a real euphemism. Every Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, the members of it were the Attorney General, the Undersecretary of State, the Director of Central Intelligence, the Director of USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, the Director of AID, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and whatever Averell Harriman was at that time, and that was it. How about the Deputy Secretary of Defense? Was Gilpatrick involved? Forgive me, yes, he was. Okay. I attended habitually as the representative of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. For many reasons, General Taylor, whom it was most of the time, did not attend, and he relied on me to attend for him. Occasionally, I represented Gilpatrick, but I attended one way or another every meeting as somebody's representative. They wanted it that way, to my despair. It was hard work. It was sod breaking, and many people appraised the problem in their own words. Their words were quite clear to them, and they meant something quite different to someone else, either in terms of time or scope, or just plain meaning. Take an example of time. Bobby Kennedy was, by all odds, the most powerful personality of the special group CI, and he was the most impatient of all the members of the special group. One occasion, the Defense Department was asked or directed, I don't know which would be the correct word, by the special group, asked, I guess, to pursue at high speed the development of a very light radio capable of penetrating the jungle canopy. Now, all of the amplitude modulated type radios have great trouble with jungle canopy. Without a very heavy power source, they can't drive their signal through the canopy. What Bobby was asking them to do was to achieve a not inconsequential technological breakthrough, but it had to be done. When the meeting was ended and we went back to our offices, there were a few who realized that at the very next Tuesday, he was going to ask, "How are you going? How are you doing?" And on about that third time, when he got no substantive response, he blew up, just blew up into fragments. A couple more weeks, they had some hardware to show him, not created, but hardware that had been borrowed and brought in. One, I think, a CIA radio, I remember another, a foreign one, to show not what had been done, but the magnitude of the problem. They still hadn't gotten around to solving it, only to appraising it. Well, he just went into orbit. He hated this. I give you this an example of a distorted view on the part of the various participants as to what was meant when something was said. In this case, Kennedy's desire to have something done at once. Oh, there's another anecdote I'm going to skip just for the sake of time. No, I won't. I need to read this one. On another occasion, certain decisions were made respecting police support in a Latin American country. Bobby said, "We need a report on our having done this, and this." Several items. He turned to the director of AID and said, "Could you bring in the experts to report on how you have fared in accomplishing these things?" The next week, the expert was there, and his report essentially was, quote, "I've taken your name and we're seeing what we can do for you." When he left the room, Bobby said to the director of AID, "Fire him." A very impatient man, he had a very clear perception of the route that we had to follow, and he inspired the admiration of many, including myself. All right, I'm skipping ahead now, and I want to get to the Ed Lansdale part. Oh, I want to get to the Operation Mongoose part. That was a 5412 committee. And actually, George Webb was mentioning this in one of his recent shows about Operation Mongoose and how the preparation for a second invasion of Cuba after the failure of the Bay of Pigs would have been done by SACSA. And George and I have talked about the likelihood that my dad may have been the person that did the organization of what turned out to be, I think, 260,000 troops and a bunch of ships and a very large operation that would, of course, been designed to succeed, as opposed to what happened at the Bay of Pigs in '61. So that all fell under Operation Mongoose, and Ed Lansdale was put in charge of Operation Mongoose. And here's the interviewer, Mr. Moss. Okay, fine. There were some other committees that were in operation at this time, in addition to the special group CI, that we hear about occasionally from time to time in these interviews. The special group 5412 committee, does that ring any bells with you? Did you participate in its deliberations at all? Would you talk about that in the same way that you talked about the special group CI? Krulak, I don't know that I should. Moss, all right, that's fair enough. I understand it. I've read the documents myself. Krulak, I'm sensitive about my knowledge of matters which at that time were highly classified, and I would not wish to do anything improper in disclosing knowledge in terms of my recollections. Well, let me ask very generally then, do you think that the kind of thing that the 5412 was doing was a realistic, practical sort of thing? Or were people misleading themselves? Krulak, it was realistic and practical. Okay, it's the name of the game. Okay, do you think it had any effects? Yes, good or bad, favorable. To this extent, every enterprise that a government or organization undertakes can be acclaimed as having some success. And the degree of success that you claim for it is largely a function of your personal enthusiasm. I don't want you to go overboard or anything that had to do with counterinsurgency as being a resounding success. However, they all moved toward the target. Does the Mongoose Committee ring any bells? Yes. And I have the same reaction to this one. Same reaction there. Okay, fine. Let me ask you about another person who's on the fringes of these things, General Lansdale. What was his part in this sort of thing? Do you know if his being nominated, not nominated, but suggested to be ambassador to Vietnam? And do you know the story of why he was turned down? Krulak, well, I find it difficult to get a handle on the subject of Edward Lansdale in terms of an interview. It's multi-sided. It's a combination of grays and blacks. It's not a clearly definable topic, and I would not wish to do him a disservice by overgeneralization. As you know, Lansdale worked for an agency of the Defense Department in the Eisenhower administration. That agency had to do with international matters, some of an intelligence nature. He held over into the Kennedy administration. His relationship with the Secretary of Defense was handled mainly through the office of the Deputy Secretary, Mr. Gilpatrick, who was the individual who knew Lansdale and managed his assignments, and sort of interpolated what he did for McNamara's eyes. There came a moment when Gilpatrick either was gone or was not available, when McNamara arrogated to himself these matters, and at that time tended to diminish the scope of Lansdale's activity for reasons best known to himself. Lansdale, as you know, had a relationship with Ngo Dinh Diem during the pre-1962 days. I say pre-62, the Kennedy days. The depth of the relationship is measured variously by the identity of the person to whom you're speaking. It may have been very deep and it may not, but it lost its significance when Diem was killed in any case. Lansdale is characterized variously as deeply knowledgeable student of Indochina and a charlatan. In this discussion, I would make only one substantive observation. Where Indochina is concerned, there are a lot of Lansdales, a lot of people whose knowledge is regarded by one as a treasure and by another as dross. And he's not alone in this. My personal relationship with him was not profound. We dealt in pretty much two different kinds of war. And I would not like to characterize further the quality of his contribution, more from a viewpoint of humility than reticence. History will have to tell. I would only say that there are a few individuals in my knowledge more damned and at the same time more applauded, and history is going to have to portray Lansdale's real part. I hope this isn't too evasive. Moss, no, I think it does just the right thing on this. Let me ask you about another person, and we're getting on to Vietnam rather quickly now. Let me ask you about the contributions of Roger Hilsman. Well, I'm not going to continue reading the transcript of this memorandum other than to just recommend it to everybody to read the whole thing, because it goes through a lot of issues that I don't have time to cover today. And I want to spend a little bit of the time on this book here, which kind of represents the history that Krulak was looking for in 1970. And so what I've done is I've highlighted the parts of this book that refer to SACSA and to General Krulak. And I'll spend the rest of the show reading as much of that as I can, and of course, with some comments. Now, if you might remember from The Secret Team by L. Fletcher Prouty, that the President Kennedy, as a result of the failure of the Bay of Pigs and following his firing of Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and General Cabell from the CIA, and our friend Bill Taylor points out he fired a fourth guy too. I can't remember his name, but at any rate, the heads rolled at the CIA, and President Kennedy decided to take all of their special ops authority away from them, unless it was a very small thing that they could handle in-house. So that was done in a series of NSAMs, National Security Action Memorandum, and this NSAM 57 is where we start reading here on page 21 of The Secret War Against Hanoi by Richard Schultz, Jr. NSAM 57 set the bureaucratic ground rules for planning and executing covert paramilitary operations by the CIA and the Defense Department. It stated that any proposed paramilitary operations must be, quote, wholly covert or disavowable, may be assigned to the CIA, provided that it is within the normal capabilities of that agency. The key phrase here was normal capabilities of the agency. NSAM 57 stated that any large paramilitary operation, wholly or partly covered, which requires significant numbers of militarily trained personnel and amounts of military equipment, will be construed to exceed normal CIA-controlled stocks and or military experience of a kind or level. These large programs would become the primary responsibility of the Department of Defense, with CIA in a supporting role. You see, President Kennedy was turning the tables. NSAM 55, 56, and 57 illustrated Kennedy's dissatisfaction with the CIA and his determination to develop the operational means to conduct unconventional warfare against North Vietnam and other denied areas. He was not about to concede the new battlefield to the other side. Beyond the operational level, this conviction was evident in other policy initiatives. For the counterinsurgency elements of special warfare, a special group, Counterinsurgency, that's the special group CI we talked about in the interview, was created in January 1962 by NSAM 124. Its purpose was to establish policy-level oversight to, quote, ensure proper recognition throughout the U.S. government that subversive insurgency is a major form of politico-military conflict equal to conventional warfare. This is JFK kind of following Eisenhower in a way, saying, yeah, if we can get it done with secret covert warfare, yeah, let's do it. Both of these veterans of World War II didn't want to engage us in a land war or any type of big war. So that was what Kennedy was hoping, was that they could figure out this counterinsurgency business, and that's why they hired Victor Krulak, and that's why they hired my dad. Given the Pentagon's increased role in counterinsurgency and covert warfare, the Joint Chiefs established the Office of the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, SACSA. The SACSA was to provide staff support to the Secretary of Defense and chairman of the JCS in carrying out the requests of the Special Group, Counterinsurgency, and the 303 Committee. All defense components involved in these missions were to provide SACSA with the support it required. Established in February 1962, the first SACSA was Marine Corps Major General Victor H. Brute Krulak. And I do have his biography. It's called Brute. It's on another shelf, but I'll share that with you another time. Krulak was an innovative thinker. He talks about how he basically invented the LCVP, the standard landing craft used by the Marines in the Pacific during World War II, and led numerous amphibious operations, dangerous nighttime raids, etc., just to summarize it. Now, I want to get to Lansdale. Page 202, Lansdale gains the upper hand over the Joint Chiefs. While Lansdale was persona non grata with the senior military leaders in the Pentagon, he had his supporters on the civilian side of the Department of Defense, including Gilpatrick. In a February 1961 memorandum to Lemnitzer, Gilpatrick directed that Brigadier General Lansdale be designated to establish and head the Office of Assistant to the Secretary of Defense. In this capacity, Lansdale was to have responsibility for 5412 committee matters, special defense activities as approved by the Special Secretary of Defense, and CIA relationships of special interest to the Secretary of Defense. In effect, Lansdale was to be McNamara's action officer for all military involvement in covert action warfare. His immediate boss, Deputy Secretary Gilpatrick, was McNamara's representative to the National Security Council's 5412 Committee. So this 5412 Committee is Operation Mongoose. Okay, so that means, that just shows you that Lansdale was initially in 1961 created as the OATSD, the Office of Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, to have responsibility for the 5412 committee matters, etc. None of this went down well with the JCS. An intense fight ensued inside the Pentagon for control of covert operations. Lansdale fired the first shot with a memorandum to the Director of the Joint Staff, Lieutenant General Earl Wheeler, in which he prescribed, quote, the most effective means of having the Joint Staff render support for his mission, unquote. With Lansdale operating under the authority of Gilpatrick and ultimately McNamara, the tone of the memo was clear. Wheeler and the Joint Staff were working for Lansdale. It stated, quote, a small team in the Joint Staff will be activated under Brigadier General David W. Gray, USA, Chief of the Subsidiary Actions Divisions, J5. Members of the team, while responsible to their superiors, will be in a position to work directly and fully with General Lansdale's office. It was a straightforward power play called by Lansdale. All right, and with a look at the clock, I'm going to skip ahead to the next caption is the Chiefs eviscerate Lansdale. Lansdale may have won the first round, but the Joint Chiefs were not about to give up. There was too much at stake. They could see the special warfare frenzy from the White House spinning out of control if they did not exercise supervision over it. However, up to this point, the Chiefs, while under a lot of pressure to take up President Kennedy's challenge, had been slow to do so. They looked like obstructionists, and JFK let the brass know of his displeasure with their lack of action. In a note to McNamara, the president stated that he was, quote, not satisfied that the Department of Defense, and in particular the Army, was according the necessary degree of attention and effort to the threat of insurgency and guerrilla warfare, unquote. Also, there were the implications of NSAM 57 for the Pentagon. Any large paramilitary operation, wholly or partly covert, which requires significant numbers of military-trained personnel and amounts of military equipment, would become the primary responsibility of the Department of Defense, with CIA in a supporting role. Until Kennedy took office, the Pentagon had been able to avoid any major involvement in covert operations. That's another major point that I want to take away from this, is that the Pentagon, the real war fighters, they did not want to be involved in covert operations. This is what's going on, is that the Sullivan and Cromwell, Dulles brothers secret war, that using covert operations, false flags, all of the Ed Lansdale routine, was abhorrent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As 1962 began, the Office of the Assistant to Secretary of Defense had responsibility for those activities that fell under NSAM 57. This was anathema to the chiefs. Lansdale was out of control, as his self-promotional endeavors demonstrated. In their estimation, he was an eccentric aberration of what a general officer should be. Even worse, policymakers were listening to him. To undermine these developments, the Joint Chiefs adopted a new strategy of cooperation, of co-optation. I guess I'm reading that right. Co-optation. The chiefs responded by creating an organizational machinery that gave the impression the Pentagon was committing itself to special warfare, while making sure the brass had control of such operations. In a clever bureaucratic move, quote, the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, directed the establishment of the SACSA, effective 23 February 1962. The Special Operation Division of the J5, complete with personnel and functions, was transferred to SACSA. And there you go. That was the Joint Chiefs of Staff cooperating with Kennedy, saying, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to take it over. And we're going to create this office, SACSA, in order for us to directly run these special operations. At the time, Krulak had mainstream views on the Vietnam conflict and strategy. He was no fan of special warfare as promoted by Lansdale. From 1962 to 64, Krulak was aligned with JCS Chairman Max Taylor and Taylor's protege in South Vietnam, MACV Commander General Paul Harkins. Krulak had also worked himself into the position of a Kennedy administration insider by playing on his World War II combat experience with the new president. After reintroducing himself to JFK, Krulak befriended his brother Bobby Kennedy and their military advisor Max Taylor. He also gained the confidence of Secretary of Defense McNamara, who was keenly attuned to Krulak's special relationship with the president. As SACSA, he was the gatekeeper the Joint Chiefs wanted. In the counterinsurgency area, he deflected the criticism by U.S. officers in the field in South Vietnam, who argued for a commitment to that approach for fighting the war. Instead, he followed the Taylor and Harkins line in 1962 that the United States was succeeding by adhering to conventional mainstream methods. Krulak strongly disagreed with Lansdale about special activities and covert operations. He would play a key role in the termination of the Office of the Assistant to Secretary of Defense and forced retirement of Ed Lansdale, the man President Kennedy said reminded him of a character straight out of an Ian Fleming novel. Oh boy, there's a lot more that I want to read, but we're running out of time, so I'm not going to try to read it any faster. No, there's just too much. So I'm going to carry this on to another show, but you can see what the point is, that President Kennedy wanted to have counterinsurgency, special operations, but he wanted it a la Victor Krulak, whose idea of counterinsurgency was to support the population with giving them a safe place to live, to have a government that has actual following among the people of the country and the city, and to exert control over things, like crime and especially drugs, which of course was the opposite of what Lansdale would have done. I will say that Krulak, in setting up the office, divided it into 4 sections. One section was called Special Plans, or the Office of Special Plans. And it's in that office, I believe, that George Webb's idea will bear fruit. We need to get a disclosure of what went on in the Office of Special Plans, as opposed to the Office of Psychological Operations and the Office of, well, I can't remember the name of it, but the actual covert ops operators, the people like General Blackburn, and the people that were actually involved in these operations. Special Plans sounds to me like the place to make a lot of plans that might not ever get used. And that, of course, resonates with the idea that it was within SACSA, within the Office of Special Plans, where Tom O'Loughlin was the planner, that the operation was actually put together. And we'll learn more as we keep studying this. You know, it's a lifetime journey for me, and I really do appreciate those of you who are following along with me. I hope you will get a copy of my book about my dad, which I don't have at hand right now, but you know what it's called, McDuff Lives. And all right, it's noon, and I thank you for your attention. I will see you tomorrow with Harley Schlanger, 11 a.m. Eastern Time.